Sunday service was in full swing at New Light Baptist Church in Orlando, Florida. Families filled the pews, the choir had just finished their final hymn, and Pastor Greg David was about to deliver his sermon. But no one was prepared for what was about to happen next. Then, without warning, Rachel Suzette, a respected member of the congregation for over 2 decades, stepped forward. In her hands was the truth, and in a matter of seconds, she would bring everything crashing down. She took a deep breath, looked directly at the man standing behind the pulpit, and said the words that would shatter an entire church community. "Pastor Greg David, you lied to me. You lied to your wife, and you lied to every single person sitting in this church today." What followed was nothing short of chaos, as secrets long buried began to surface, and a once united congregation found itself on the brink of collapse. Rachel Suzette had always believed in the power of faith. For over 25 years, she sat in the same pew every Sunday, sang the same hymns, and listened to the words of every pastor who stood behind the pulpit. She had built her life around this church. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was her home, her safe space, the place she turned to in times of joy and sorrow. And when Pastor Greg David arrived at New Light Baptist Church, she welcomed him just as she had welcomed every leader before him, with trust, with reverence, with faith. Greg David was charismatic. People gravitated toward him. He had a way of speaking that made you feel like he was talking directly to you, like his sermons weren't just words from the Bible, but answers to the struggles you carried in your heart. To the congregation, he was more than a pastor. He was a guide, a man of God, a pillar of their community. No one ever questioned his wisdom, his leadership, or his integrity. Rachel certainly didn't. When Greg first arrived at the church, Rachel barely noticed him. She was still grieving the loss of her husband, trying to raise her teenage sons while balancing work and faith. She wasn't looking for anything, especially not the attention of a pastor. Their interactions were polite, nothing more than casual conversations after Sunday service, or a nod in acknowledgement when they passed each other in the halls. But over time, things changed. Greg had a way of listening that made people open up. It was part of what made him such an effective leader, his ability to make anyone feel seen, heard, understood. When Rachel spoke, he didn't just nod along. He asked questions, remembered details, followed up days later. It started with small things, a comment on how hard it must be to raise 2 boys alone, an offer to pray with her, a passing remark about how the church was always there for her if she needed support. Rachel hadn't realized how much she needed that attention until it was given to her. She had spent years putting others first, her husband, her children, her church. For the first time, someone was asking about her. She told herself it was harmless. He was a pastor, a married man, a man of God. He wasn't interested in her, not in that way. And she wasn't interested in him. But there were moments, subtle, fleeting moments that she struggled to ignore. The way he looked at her when she spoke, the way his hand would linger a second longer than necessary when he offered a comforting touch on the shoulder, the warmth in his voice when he said her name. Then came the messages. They started off as scripture, encouraging words, Bible verses meant to uplift. Then casual check-ins. How are you? How are the boys? How's work? At first she responded without hesitation. He was her pastor. Of course she could talk to him. Then she hesitated. Then she second-guessed. Then she couldn't stop thinking about him. Greg made her feel special. He made her feel seen. And that more than anything was what pulled her in. Not attraction, not desire, but the feeling that, for the first time in years, someone cared about her in a way that went beyond sympathy. She tried to ignore it. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. But the more she pushed it away, the stronger it became. The more she wanted to talk to him, the more she wanted to be near him. And then one evening, something different happened. It had been a long day. She had stayed late after service to help clean up, something she had done dozens of times before. By the time she was ready to leave, most of the congregation was gone. Only a few people remained, chatting in the parking lot, locking up the doors. Greg was there too. She hadn't expected him to stay so late. And when she saw him, her heart did something she didn't want to acknowledge. He smiled, walked over, asked if she was okay. She told him she was fine, just tired. He offered to walk her to her car, and when they reached it, he hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for her to notice. Then he asked if she would mind giving him her number. Rachel froze. He must have seen the hesitation in her eyes because he quickly clarified, just to check in, nothing more. She told herself it was innocent. She gave him the number. And that was how it started. From that night on, things were different. The texts became more frequent. The conversations became longer. And somewhere along the way, the line between pastor and parishioner blurred. Rachel knew it was wrong. She knew what people would say if they found out. But she also knew how she felt. And those feelings, no matter how hard she tried to fight them, were real. 3 months after that night in the parking lot, Greg asked if she wanted to meet somewhere private, just to talk, just to clear the air. Rachel agreed. She told herself it was a mistake even as she got dressed, even as she drove to the meeting spot, even as she sat across from him and told herself nothing would happen. And then he kissed her. It was brief, soft, just a moment. But that was the turning point. Because in that moment, Rachel stopped fighting what she had known for weeks. This wasn't just a friendship. This wasn't just support. This was something else entirely. And once that door was open, there was no closing it. Now, what started as a few stolen moments quickly turned into something neither of them could ignore. They told themselves they were careful. They told themselves no one would ever know. They told themselves it wasn't hurting anyone. They were wrong. The second time Rachel Suzette crossed the line, it wasn't planned either. It wasn't some dramatic moment of weakness or an impulsive decision made under the cover of night. It happened the way most things like this do, slowly, gradually, step by step, until there was no turning back. She told herself yet again it was harmless, that there was nothing wrong with late-night conversations, with laughter that lasted longer than it should, with the kind of closeness that felt natural, familiar. It was late on a Tuesday night. Rachel had spent the evening at a church meeting and was exhausted by the time she got home. She had just sat down when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Greg. "Thinking about you today. Hope you're doing okay." It wasn't unusual. He had sent messages like this before, but something about this one was different. It wasn't a response to anything she had said. It wasn't tied to church or scripture. It was just about her. She stared at the screen for a long time before responding. "I'm okay. Just tired. Long day." His reply came almost immediately. "Wish I could take that stress away." Rachel hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Something about those words made her heart beat faster, made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't want to acknowledge. She knew she should end the conversation. Instead, she typed back, "Me too." It was just 2 words, but they changed everything. They stopped being about church, about faith, about casual conversations. They became about them, about how much he enjoyed talking to her, about how much he looked forward to seeing her every Sunday, about how she made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. She told herself it was just words, that as long as nothing physical happened, it wasn't real. But deep down, she knew better. The second time he touched her, really touched her, it was after an evening service. Most of the congregation had already left, but Rachel stayed behind, tidying up hymn books, straightening chairs. Greg was still there, talking to one of the deacons. When the man left, it was just the 2 of them. Rachel turned to say goodbye, but before she could, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was nothing, a simple gesture, but the way his fingers brushed against her skin sent a wave of heat through her body. Their eyes met, and in that second, nothing else existed. Not the church, not his wife, not the weight of the vows he had made at the altar, just the silence between them, thick with everything they weren't saying. She was the first to look away, the first to step back, the first to remind herself that this was wrong, that this couldn't happen. But a week later, it did. It was supposed to be just a drive, a way to talk without the walls of the church surrounding them, a way to get clarity, to figure out what they were doing before it went too far. Rachel had barely buckled her seatbelt when Greg reached across the console and took her hand in his. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said. She should have pulled away. She should have told him to turn the car around. Instead, she whispered, "Me too." Then came the second kiss, not planned. It wasn't passionate. It was hesitant, uncertain, as if both of them were testing a boundary they knew they shouldn't cross. The next time they met, it was at a small motel just outside of town. It was discreet, away from familiar eyes. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as Greg paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "We don't have to do this," he said. But they both knew that was a lie. The Bible on the nightstand felt like an accusation. The cross around Greg's neck used a weight pressing against his chest. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the way his lips felt on hers, the way his hands traced over her skin, the way, for the first time in years, she felt wanted. What started as stolen moments quickly became something neither of them could walk away from. They made excuses to see each other. Late-night drives, weekend retreats for church planning, meetings that stretched longer than they should. No one suspected a thing. There were signs, subtle at first. The way Greg's eyes lingered on Rachel during sermons, the way she avoided his wife at church events, the way they always seemed to arrive at the same time, leave at the same time, the way Rachel, who had once been so devoted to worship, now seemed distracted during service, glancing up at the pulpit not in reverence, but in longing. And then there were the texts, late at night, early in the morning, messages that Greg thought were private, hidden from the world, until they weren't. The moment the big break came, the moment the affair stopped being a secret, wasn't because of guilt. It wasn't because of regret. It was because of a single message seen by the wrong eyes. Greg had been careless. He had sent a message late one night, a message he didn't think twice about, but his wife did. "Why are you thinking about her at this hour?" That was the question his wife asked him the next morning, holding up his phone, Rachel's name still glowing on the screen. Greg denied it. He lied. He told his wife she was imagining things, that it was just church business, but something had shifted. She didn't believe him. And she wasn't the only one starting to notice. At church the following Sunday, Rachel felt the stares, women whispering behind her back, men looking at Greg with something different in their eyes, suspicion, doubt. She tried to ignore it. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, but deep down she knew. Secrets don't stay buried forever, and theirs was about to be exposed in the most public way imaginable. Rachel Suzette had always known that secrets carried weight, but she never expected the weight of this one to become unbearable. For months, she and Pastor Greg David had lived inside a fragile illusion, one where their stolen moments existed in a space untouched by consequences. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't obvious, but it was there, a shift, a distance she couldn't ignore. At first, she told herself she was imagining things, that Greg was just busy, that the growing silence between them wasn't deliberate. But the feeling lingered, gnawed at the edges of her thoughts, until she could no longer pretend. It was the little things, the way his responses became shorter, the way his once frequent late-night messages dwindled into polite, sporadic check-ins, the way he suddenly seemed more cautious, more aware of their surroundings whenever they spoke in public, the way he no longer looked at her the way he used to. Rachel tried to push the doubts away, but they grew stronger with each passing day. And then, one Sunday, everything became painfully clear. She arrived at church early, as she always did, expecting to see Greg before the service. It had become their routine, a few stolen minutes in the quiet of the sanctuary before the congregation filled the pews. But that morning, Greg wasn't there. She waited, watched the door, checked her phone, nothing. When he finally arrived, he didn't meet her eyes. He walked past her as if she were just another member of the church, another face in the crowd. No acknowledgement, no smile, nothing. Rachel's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. After the service, she found him in his office, closing the door quickly behind her. Greg didn't greet her. He didn't reach for her the way he once had. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. "We need to stop this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel felt the air leave her lungs. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it was different. Final, like a door slamming shut. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. Greg sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's too risky. People are starting to talk." Rachel felt something crack inside her. So that's what this is about? Not guilt, not regret, just the fear of getting caught? Greg didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. Rachel stared at him, searching for the man who had once made her feel like she was the only person in the world. But he wasn't there. The warmth, the affection, it was gone, replaced by something cold, something distant. "I thought you cared about me," she whispered. Greg exhaled heavily. "I do, but this has to end." Rachel nodded slowly. She had no choice but to accept it, but deep down something inside her had already begun to shift. The doubt, the suspicion, it wasn't just about Greg's feelings, it was about the truth she had ignored for too long. And she couldn't ignore it any longer. She left his office that day feeling empty, but she wasn't angry, not yet. That would come later. What came first was the silence. She stopped texting him, stopped looking for him at church, stopped waiting for the messages that no longer came. And with every passing day, the weight of what she had done settled heavier on her shoulders. She carried that weight for 2 years. And then came the retreat. It wasn't planned. Rachel hadn't been searching for answers, hadn't been looking for a way to heal. But when the opportunity came, a weekend of solitude, prayer, and reflection, she took it, not knowing that by the end of it, she would no longer be the same. The retreat was held at a small monastery just outside of town, a quiet place, surrounded by nothing but open fields and winding roads. It was meant for silence, for stillness, for clarity. Rachel spent the first day avoiding her own thoughts. She read scripture. She walked the grounds. She sat in the chapel, staring at the candles flickering in the dim light. But no matter how hard she tried to quiet her mind, the memories found her. Greg's voice, his touch, the way he had made her feel like she was the only one, only to cast her aside the moment it became inconvenient. For the first time, she let herself feel the anger she had buried beneath guilt and shame. She let herself question everything, his words, his promises, his so-called love. And then the realization hit her, sudden and sharp, like a wound she hadn't realized was still open. She had been nothing more than a secret, a temporary escape from a life he no longer wanted but didn't have the courage to leave. And when it was no longer convenient, he had done what men like him always did. He had erased her. Rachel clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had spent 2 years carrying the weight of his choices, of his lies, of his cowardice. She had spent 2 years allowing herself to be ashamed of something that was never hers to bear alone. But shame had no place here anymore. Not now. Not after everything she had lost. She knew what she had to do. It was no longer about Greg. It was no longer about the affair. It was about truth, about the lies they had both told, about the illusion that had protected him while she suffered in silence. Masks had to fall, and Rachel was ready to remove hers. It was a Sunday morning like any other. The congregation of New Light Baptist Church gathered in the pews, flipping through hymn books, greeting one another with smiles and warm handshakes. Families filled the rows, children fidgeted beside their parents, and the choir stood ready to begin the opening hymn. It was the kind of morning that felt routine, predictable, the kind of morning where no one expected anything to change. Rachel Suzette sat in her usual seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her pulse thundering in her ears. She had rehearsed the moment over and over in her head, played out every possible reaction, every consequence. But now that she was here, staring at the man standing at the pulpit, she realized there was no way to prepare for what was about to happen. Pastor Greg David stepped forward, adjusting his tie, his familiar voice filling the sanctuary as he welcomed the congregation. His words were smooth, his demeanor composed. If he felt any sense of unease, he didn't show it. To everyone in that church, he was still their trusted leader, their spiritual guide. But Rachel knew better, and in a few moments, so would everyone else. The choir began to sing, a slow, melodic hymn that echoed through the high ceilings of the church. Rachel took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the pew. She had waited long enough. She had carried the weight of this truth for too long. As the final note of the hymn faded into silence, Rachel rose to her feet. For a second, no one noticed. The congregation shifted in their seats, flipping through their Bibles, preparing for the sermon. But then her voice cut through the quiet. "I have something to say." Heads turned. The air in the room changed, a ripple of confusion spreading through the pews. Pastor Greg's expression faltered for the briefest moment before he quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "Sister Rachel, now may not be the—" "No, it has to be now." Rachel's voice was steady, louder this time, filled with something unshakable. The congregation shifted, murmurs rising as eyes moved between her and the pastor. She felt the weight of every gaze on her, but she didn't waver. "I've carried a secret for too long," she continued. "A secret that this man," she turned toward Greg, her eyes locking onto his, "never wanted any of you to know." The murmur turned into whispers. Greg's face stiffened. His hands gripped the sides of the pulpit. "Rachel, no, you don't get to interrupt me. Not this time." Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths. She had spent years being silent, years convincing herself this was just her burden to carry. But this was no longer just about her. "For months I was involved in an affair with Pastor Greg David." The reaction was immediate. Gasps, a few scattered cries of shock. Hands flew to mouths, eyes widened, whispers turned to outright disbelief. Rachel didn't look away, didn't flinch as the weight of her words settled over the congregation like a heavy storm. "He told me he loved me," she continued, "that his marriage was broken, that I was the only one." Greg's composure finally cracked. His face paled. His lips parted as if searching for the right words, but nothing came. He had always been so eloquent, so sure of himself, but now, standing before a sea of stunned faces, he had nothing to say. And then from the back of the church, another voice rang out. "He told me the same thing." Silence fell. Every head turned. A woman stood, her face flushed, her hands gripping the back of the pew in front of her. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Then another woman stood, and another. Whispers turned to shock. Shock turned to outrage. The realization washed over the congregation like a tidal wave, shattering the illusion that had protected Pastor Greg for so long. He hadn't just betrayed his wife. He hadn't just deceived one woman. He had deceived many. Greg staggered back a step, his face shock written all over. His wife, sitting in the front row, had gone rigid, her hands trembling in her lap. The church elders exchanged looks of disbelief, struggling to process what was unfolding before them. Rachel didn't move. She didn't have to. The truth was no longer just hers to tell. It was pouring out now, unstoppable, undeniable. One of the elders rose from his seat, clearing his throat. "Pastor David, is this true?" Greg opened his mouth. No words came out. The weight of his silence was enough. A woman in the third row let out a strangled sob. A man shook his head in disgust. Voices rose, questions fired from all directions. "How long has this been going on? Is this who we've been following? He stood in this church and lied to us." The sanctuary, once a place of worship, had turned into a courtroom, and Greg David was on trial in front of his own congregation. Rachel let out a slow breath. She had imagined this moment 100 different ways. She had wondered if she would feel guilt, regret, fear. But all she felt now was relief. She had done what she came to do. The rest was no longer in her hands. The sanctuary was never the same after that Sunday. The pews where families once sat in unity now felt divided. The pulpit, once a symbol of faith and trust, stood empty for weeks. The man who had preached from it, the man they had looked up to, the man they had called their shepherd, was gone. Pastor Greg David did not return to New Light Baptist Church. The elders called an emergency meeting that evening. By Monday morning, an official statement was released. Greg David had been placed on immediate leave while the church conducted an internal investigation. But within days, he made it easy for them. He resigned. There was no farewell sermon, no final words, no attempt to defend himself. He simply disappeared. Some said he left town. Others claimed he was still in Orlando, trying to piece his life back together. His wife, devastated and humiliated, filed for divorce within the month. The house they had shared for years was sold soon after. By all accounts, Greg David was a man who had lost everything. But for Rachel Suzette, the fallout was just beginning. She had expected backlash, and it came. Some members of the congregation refused to speak to her. Others whispered behind her back. There were those who called her a homewrecker, a woman who had brought shame to the church. Even those who had once called her a friend now looked at her differently. But there was another side to it. Women who had never spoken up before now came forward with their own stories. Some had been manipulated by men in power. Some had carried their own secrets, their own shame. And for the first time, they felt like they weren't alone. Rachel never wanted to be a voice for anyone. She never wanted to be the woman who stood in front of a congregation and exposed a man they had trusted. But standing there, watching the truth unravel, she knew it had been the only choice. The guilt still lingered. She had hurt people: Greg's wife, his family, his children, the congregation. And yet, even with that weight pressing on her, she knew one thing. She had no regrets. Rachel once believed that silence was the answer, that if she buried the truth deep enough, it would disappear. But the truth had a way of rising, of demanding to be seen, and when it did, there was no stopping it. Secrets always come to light. New Light Baptist Church moved forward. A new pastor was eventually chosen. The congregation tried to rebuild, tried to find faith again. But the damage lingered. Trust, once broken, does not mend overnight. Rachel still attends church, not at New Light, but somewhere else. A smaller congregation, a quieter place. A place where she is not the woman who stood up that Sunday morning, but just another person seeking redemption, seeking peace. And if there's one thing this story has proven, it's this: secrets don't stay buried forever. They never do. What would you have done in Rachel's position? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent, knowing the truth could destroy everything? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in the world of true crime, the truth is always waiting to be uncovered.